The preservation protocols had been galactic law for approximately 3,000 standard cycles, which was long enough that most species had forgotten why they existed in the first place. The official documentation stated, with all the dry precision of interstellar bureaucracy, that any civilization wishing to join the greater community must first demonstrate they had evolved beyond primitive combustion methods. In practice, this meant handing over your matches, your lighters, your flint and steel, and anything else that might create fire without the proper technological safeguards, environmental impact assessments, and triplicate permission forms. The reasoning was sound, or so the architects of the protocols insisted. Fire was dangerous. Fire was unpredictable. Fire had destroyed countless forests, habitats, and occasionally entire planetary ecosystems before species learned to control it properly. Better to skip straight to plasma heating elements and controlled fusion reactors, which were much safer because they came with instruction manuals and required certified technicians to operate. The fact that these same fusion reactors occasionally underwent catastrophic failures that vaporized city blocks was considered an acceptable trade-off for not having to worry about some primitive ancestor rubbing two sticks together. It became the ultimate litmus test of civilization. Had your species given up fire-making? Congratulations, you were civilized. Still clinging to combustion? Back to the Stone Age with you, metaphorically speaking. The galaxy had standards, after all. Which brought us to Keltar 7, a moon so unremarkable that its only claim to fame was being the perfect place to strand people who needed to learn valuable lessons about respecting technology. The Interspecies Survival Training Program had established their base here specifically because Keltar 7 was inhospitable enough to be challenging, but not quite deadly enough to generate paperwork-intensive casualties. The temperature swung from pleasantly warm during the brief day to teeth-chattering cold at night. The atmosphere was breathable, but tasted vaguely of sulfur, and the local wildlife had the good sense to be more irritating than lethal. The current training group consisted of 15 cadets from various species, 3 instructors who had drawn the short straw in the assignment lottery, and 1 human who had somehow volunteered for this experience. His name was Marcus Chen, though that detail matters less than what he represented, a species so new to the galactic community that their admission paperwork was still being processed in 7 different departments. The lead instructor was a Vex named Kurik, whose compound eyes gave him the permanent appearance of someone who had just smelled something unpleasant. His exoskeleton gleamed an iridescent blue-green, and his mandibles clicked in a rhythm that other Vex found soothing but most species found deeply unsettling. He took his role seriously, which was unfortunate because taking oneself seriously while being a 3-foot-tall insectoid with a voice like grinding gears rarely inspired the intended gravitas. The safety officer was Coolanth, an amphibious quillmith, whose species had evolved in the swamps of their homeworld and never quite lost the damp, algae-scented atmosphere that followed them everywhere. She wore a moisture suit that periodically misted her skin, producing a faint hissing sound that punctuated conversations at awkward moments. Her dedication to regulations bordered on religious fervor. Rounding out the training staff was Coordinator Brecken, a Thornian, whose species prided themselves on their administrative capabilities. He had 17 fingers, which seemed excessive, until one watched him operate multiple data tablets simultaneously while maintaining perfect posture. His grey skin had the texture of weathered stone, and his 4 eyes tracked everything with the intensity of someone waiting for the universe to violate a protocol so he could file the appropriate complaint. The alien cadets were a nervous bunch, mostly young civilians fulfilling mandatory civic training requirements. They wore climate-controlled suits rated for extreme environments, carried enough emergency supplies to survive a month-long disaster, and clutched their communication devices like security blankets. Each had packed the standard-issue equipment list with religious adherents, thermal generators, plasma igniters, water purification tablets, and enough freeze-dried nutrition paste to feed a small army. Marcus stood among them wearing a basic jumpsuit, carrying a backpack that seemed suspiciously light, and displaying the sort of calm that came from either supreme confidence or complete ignorance of what he had signed up for. The smart money was on a combination of both. The first order of business, once they had transported down to the surface and gathered at the staging area, was equipment inspection. This was Colin's favorite part of the program. She approached it with the enthusiasm of someone who had found their true calling in life, making sure nobody had anything interesting. Instructor Chiric's mandibles clicked in his approximation of an authoritative tone. Attention, cadets. As outlined in your pre-training materials, Section 7, Subsection 4, Paragraph 12, all independent ignition devices must be surrendered for the duration of this exercise. This is non-negotiable and serves to teach you proper appreciation for the technological advances that separate us from our primitive ancestors. One by one, the cadets shuffled forward to deposit their fire-starting equipment into a secured container. A young draftnext cadet, whose fur was puffed up in obvious anxiety, reluctantly placed his emergency plasma igniter in the box. A Kelmorian with bioluminescent skin patterns that flickered with distress added her thermal starter. Even the usually stoic Varnish cadets seemed uncomfortable, surrendering their fusion lighters, though they maintained proper military bearing throughout the process. Marcus stepped up when his turn came, reaching into his pocket with casual ease. He pulled out a standard-issue utility lighter, the kind handed out by the dozens in equipment lockers across every human vessel, and dropped it into the container with a soft clink. "That's everything?" Coolance asked, her large eyes narrowing with suspicion. "That's everything," Marcus confirmed with a smile that was either innocent or the most perfectly executed poker face in the galaxy. Coolance checked her tablet, scrolling through the inventory list. No backup ignition source, no emergency fire starter, no thermal catalyst. Nope. She made a notation on her device, the stylus clicking against the screen. "Very well, your compliance is noted and appreciated." Coordinator Brecken sealed the container with the kind of finality usually reserved for sealing ancient tombs. "This equipment will be returned to you upon successful completion of the training program. Should you require fire or heat during the exercise, approved protocols must be followed." He gestured to a nearby equipment case containing what appeared to be the galaxy's most over-engineered emergency beacon. Each group will have access to one emergency summoning device. Activation will dispatch a thermal support drone within 6 to 8 standard hours. "Hours?" squeaked one of the draftnext cadets. "Emergency response requires proper verification procedures," Brecken explained with the patience of someone who had given this speech many times. "We must confirm the emergency is genuine, file the appropriate requests, and ensure the drone is available and properly calibrated. Safety is our primary concern." What he did not say, but what everyone understood, was that the 6 to 8 hour response time was also designed to encourage cadets to think very carefully about whether they truly needed to activate their emergency beacon or whether they could tough it out a little longer. Character building, they called it. Bureaucratic sadism, the cadets called it, though never within earshot of the instructors. The training group set out across Keltar 7's rocky terrain as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The landscape was a study in desolation, rust-colored rocks, patches of hardy scrub vegetation that looked like it was angry about existing, and the occasional outcropping of crystalline formations that refracted the fading sunlight into weak rainbows. The temperature was still pleasant, hovering in the comfortable range that made the alien cadets walk with confidence. That confidence would not last. Keltar 7's rotational period was only 16 standard hours, which meant sunset came with aggressive punctuality. One moment there was light, the next moment there was the kind of darkness that made people religious. And with the darkness came the cold, dropping from comfortable to concerning in the span of 30 minutes. They reached the designated campsite just as the temperature began its nosedive. It was a clearing surrounded by rock formations that provided minimal shelter from the wind that had suddenly decided to make an appearance. The alien cadets immediately activated their climate-controlled suits, the soft hum of heating elements filling the air. They clustered together, already eyeing the emergency beacon with the sort of longing usually reserved for beloved family members. Instructor Chiric's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval or disappointment. It was genuinely hard to tell with Vex. "We will make camp here for the night. As you can observe, the temperature is dropping rapidly. This is by design. You will learn to appreciate the technology that protects you by briefly experiencing what life was like before such conveniences." "How cold does it get?" asked one of the Kelmorian cadets, her bioluminescent patterns flickering nervously. "Survivable," Kolenth answered, which was technically true but spectacularly unhelpful. "Your suits are rated for these conditions. However, you may experience discomfort. Should the situation become genuinely dangerous, the emergency beacon is available." Coordinator Brecken was already setting up the beacon, placing it on a flat rock with ceremonial precision. "Remember, activation initiates a 6 to 8 hour response protocol. The thermal support drone will bring heating equipment sufficient for the entire group. Consider carefully whether your discomfort warrants such a response." The temperature continued dropping. The alien cadets huddled in their suits, heating elements working overtime. Their breath misted in the air. Some activated additional warming layers. Others began to shiver, despite their technology. The cold was not life-threatening, not yet, but it was deeply, profoundly unpleasant. Marcus, notably, had wandered away from the group. He moved among the rock formations with purpose, occasionally bending to examine something on the ground, picking up stones and inspecting them before either pocketing them or tossing them aside. He gathered handfuls of the dried scrub brush, the kind that looked like it had given up on photosynthesis out of spite. "What are you doing?" Chirik called out, mandibles clicking with irritation. "Return to the group. Wandering off alone violates Protocol 7. "Just gathering supplies," Marcus called back, his breath visible in the rapidly cooling air. He was not wearing any visible heating elements. His jumpsuit was standard issue, uninsulated, the kind of thing that should have had him shivering within minutes. Yet he moved with easy confidence, completely unbothered by the cold that had the alien cadets contemplating their life choices. "Supplies for what?" Kolenth asked suspiciously. All necessary supplies were provided. Marcus did not answer immediately. He had found what he was looking for, a specific type of rock, grayish with sharp edges. He collected several pieces, along with what looked like a chunk of rusted metal from some ancient piece of equipment that had been abandoned on this moon decades ago. Then he returned to the group, dumping his collection in a clear spot a short distance from the huddled aliens. The temperature was now genuinely dangerous. The alien cadets were shivering despite their suits. The heating elements were struggling to keep up with the plummeting temperature. Several cadets were eyeing the emergency beacon with desperate longing, doing mental calculations about whether 6 hours of misery was better than 8 hours of waiting for rescue. That was when they heard it. Crack. Snap. Crackle. The sound of combustion is distinctive. It has a quality that bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to something primal in most species' hindbrain. The sound of fire means warmth, safety, and the ability to cook food that will not give you parasites. For species that had not heard uncontrolled combustion in generations, it had an almost mythical quality. Every head turned in unison. Marcus sat beside a small but growing fire, flames licking upward from a pile of the dried scrub brush he had collected. The orange light danced across his face as he carefully arranged larger pieces of vegetation around the growing blaze. Around the fire, he had positioned several flat stones in a rough circle. The silence that followed was the silence of minds attempting to process something that should not be possible. Colanthe was the first to break it, her voice rising to a pitch that probably qualified as a safety hazard. "What have you done? How did you smuggle contraband?" "That is a direct violation of, I didn't smuggle anything," Marcus interrupted calmly, adding another piece of dried brush to his fire. The flames grew larger, and the warmth began to radiate outward in a way that made every shivering alien take an involuntary step closer. "You cannot make fire," Coordinator Brecken stated flatly, his 4 eyes wide with shock. "You surrendered your ignition device. We checked. We verified. The container is sealed." "I surrendered my lighter," Marcus agreed. He held up his right hand, showing them the grey stone he had collected. Then he held up his left hand, displaying the chunk of rusted metal. "I didn't surrender these." Instructor Chiric's mandibles clattered in what might have been confusion or the insectoid equivalent of a system error. "Those are rocks. Rocks cannot create fire. That violates basic thermodynamic principles." "Does it though?" Marcus asked pleasantly. He positioned the stone and metal close together, then struck them sharply. A spray of sparks flew from the impact point, bright and brief but unmistakably real. Several alien cadets made sounds of alarm. One of the draftnecks actually yelped. Marcus struck the stone and metal together again, directing the sparks onto a small bundle of dried material he had shredded into fine strands. The sparks landed, began to smolder, and with gentle blowing, burst into a small flame. He transferred this to his fire pile, where it eagerly consumed the waiting fuel. The aliens stared. Their species had conquered faster-than-light travel, had mapped multiple galaxies, had created artificial intelligence that could contemplate its own existence and file appropriate tax returns. Yet they stood before a human and 2 rocks with the comprehension of children watching a magic show. "That is impossible," Colanthe whispered, though the evidence of her eyes suggested otherwise. "You created fire from stone. Stone cannot become fire. It lacks the necessary chemical properties, the energy transfer mechanisms, that cooled flint and steel," Marcus explained, as though discussing basic arithmetic. "Well, technically this is flint and rusty iron, but the principle is the same. The iron and stone create friction and sparks when struck together. The sparks are hot enough to ignite tinder. The tinder lights the kindling. The kindling lights the fuel. Pretty straightforward, really." "Straightforward," Coordinator Brecken repeated, his voice hollow. He checked his tablet with mounting desperation, scrolling through regulations at a speed that suggested a man watching his understanding of reality collapse. "The preservation protocols specifically prohibit devices and technology capable of creating ignition. You agreed to surrender all such items." "I did surrender all such items," Marcus pointed out reasonably. "These aren't devices, they're rocks, and some old metal. If rocks are devices, you've got bigger problems than my campfire." The fire crackled merrily, completely indifferent to the philosophical crisis it was causing. The warmth spread outward in a circle that encompassed the shivering aliens. Despite their confusion, despite their shock, despite the fact that everything they knew about civilization was being challenged by stones and dried grass, they moved closer to the heat. Biology trumped ideology when the temperature was threatening hypothermia. Instructor Chirrut attempted to regain control of the situation. "This is highly irregular. We must document this. File reports. The protocols must have something that addresses." He trailed off, mandibles clicking uncertainly. "Addresses what?" Marcus asked. "Addresses the fact that humans never actually forgot how to make fire, that we still teach this to our children as part of basic survival training, that giving up fire-starting devices is not the same as giving up the knowledge of how to create fire." The implications hung in the air, heavier than the smoke rising from the campfire. The preservation protocols were based on a fundamental assumption that surrendering fire-making technology meant surrendering the capability entirely, that once a species moved beyond primitive combustion, they could not return to it even if they wanted to. That advancement was a one-way street with no exits. Humans, it seemed, had kept the map to all the exits. Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out several items that made the watching aliens twitch with renewed confusion. A sharpened stick, some plant bulbs he had apparently foraged during their hike, what looked suspiciously like a small fish he had caught in one of the streams they had crossed. He began preparing food with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. "You going to eat that?" asked one of the Kelmorian cadets, watching with horrified fascination as Marcus skewered the fish on the sharpened stick. "That was the plan," Marcus confirmed. He positioned the fish over the fire, turning it slowly to cook evenly. The smell of roasting protein filled the air, cutting through the sulfur taint of Keltar 7's atmosphere. It was a smell that transcended species barriers, the smell of food being prepared, of sustenance being created through the application of heat and time. The alien cadets, who had been subsisting on carefully calculated nutrition paste, began to salivate. Some of them did not even have salivary glands, which made the reaction all the more impressive. Coolant pulled out her tablet, recording everything with the frantic energy of someone who knew this was going to become a case study, discussed in training seminars for years. "You're purifying water by boiling it. You're using combustion for food preparation. These are primitive techniques, dangerous techniques. Uncontrolled combustion creates particulate matter, releases carbon compounds, produces unpredictable heat levels, and it works," Marcus interrupted gently. He pulled the cooked fish from the fire, testing it with his fingers before nodding in satisfaction. "It works without needing batteries, without needing maintenance, without needing certified technicians or instruction manuals. It works if you're stranded on a hostile moon with nothing but rocks and dried grass. It works because humans never forgot how to make it work." He broke the fish into portions, offering them to the watching aliens. There was a moment of hesitation, a collective weighing of protocols against hunger and curiosity. Then one of the Draftneck's cadets reached out, took a piece and bit into it. The expression that crossed his face was revelation. Fire-cooked food has a quality that no amount of technological food preparation can replicate. Something about the smoke, the char, the uneven heat creates flavors that processed nutrition paste could never achieve. It was not just sustenance. It was an experience. Within moments the entire group was gathered around the fire, sharing Marcus's meal. The human had not brought enough for everyone, but what he had brought he divided generously. The aliens ate with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discovering a new form of entertainment, making small sounds of appreciation between bites. Coordinator Brecken watched this unfold with the expression of someone witnessing the heat death of his carefully organized universe. This is not how this training is supposed to proceed. The cadets are meant to experience discomfort, to learn appreciation for technology, to understand the importance of what? Marcus asked, turning another vegetable bulb over the fire, of being helpless without technology, of forgetting how to survive with nothing but your hands and your brain. Is that really what you want to teach them? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Marcus continued speaking, his tone conversational but pointed. Here's the thing about humans. We adopted your technology because it's convenient, not because we needed it. We still remember how to start fires with friction. We still know which plants are edible and which will kill you. We can navigate by stars, purify water with sand and charcoal, create tools from raw materials. We chose to use your plasma igniters and fusion reactors because they're easier, not because we forgot the alternatives. He gestured around the campfire, where the alien cadets sat in warmth and relative comfort, eating food and drinking boiled water. You made them dependent on technology by taking away their knowledge of anything else. You taught them that losing their devices means losing their capability. That's not civilization, that's just fragility with better packaging. Instructor Shirik's mandibles clicked slowly, a sign of deep thought in his species. You are suggesting that the preservation protocols have made the galaxy weaker. I'm suggesting that there's a difference between choosing not to use something and forgetting how to use it, Marcus replied. He added another piece of fuel to the fire, which accepted it eagerly. One is wisdom, the other is just amnesia with pretensions. The conversation was interrupted by a mechanical whirring sound. Over the horizon, a rescue drone appeared, its running lights cutting through the darkness. It approached the campsite with automated precision, scanning for the emergency beacon signal that had summoned it. Except nobody had activated the emergency beacon. The drone circled the campsite, its sensors trying to make sense of what they were detecting. Heat signature, confirmed. Life signs, multiple species present. Emergency beacon inactive. Thermal support equipment, apparently not needed, because everyone was sitting around something that registered as an open combustion reaction, which should not be possible, according to every protocol in its database. The drone's confusion was almost palpable. It circled twice more, recorded everything, then transmitted a priority alert that brought 2 more drones, then a supervisor in a transport shuttle, then a scientific observer who claimed to be documenting atmospheric anomalies but was clearly just curious. By the time the official response team arrived, Marcus had cooked a second meal and was explaining to a rapt audience of alien cadets how to identify edible plants, how to create basic tools from available materials, and how to build a shelter using nothing but branches and determination. The trainers had given up trying to restore order and were instead taking frantic notes, presumably for the incident reports that would consume the next several weeks. The supervisor, a Thornian administrator named Kelrick, who outranked everyone present by approximately 7 bureaucratic levels, descended from his shuttle with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested heads were going to roll, careers were going to end, and forms were going to be filed in triplicate. He took one look at the campfire, the comfortable aliens, and the human casually roasting vegetables, and stopped walking. Explain, he said simply. Coordinator Brecken attempted to do exactly that, his 17 fingers dancing across multiple tablets simultaneously as he pulled up relevant protocols, training guidelines, and equipment manifests. His explanation devolved into increasingly technical jargon about preservation protocol interpretations, equipment classification standards, and the definition of what constituted a device versus a tool versus raw materials. Kelrick held up one hand, silencing the flood of words. He turned to Marcus. "You created fire using rocks. And some rust, technically," Marcus confirmed. "And this violates no protocols, none that specifically prohibit rocks from being rocks," Marcus said diplomatically. Kelrick considered this for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a grinding, gravelly sound that suggested his species did not laugh often, but when they did, they meant it. "We have," he said slowly, "spent 3,000 cycles creating regulations to prevent fire-making technology from falling into uncivilized hands. We have classified devices, restricted materials, monitored distribution channels. We have built an entire framework of civilization around the assumption that surrendering fire-making devices meant surrendering fire-making capability." He gestured to Marcus and his campfire. "And you just struck two rocks together." "To be fair," Marcus said, "they're the right kind of rocks." "The right kind of rocks," Kelrick repeated. He turned to face the assembled cadets, trainers and response team. "Do you understand what this means? Our entire measurement of civilization is based on a faulty premise. We assumed that technological advancement meant abandoning primitive techniques. Humans have advanced technology and primitive techniques. They chose to adopt our standards, not because they needed to, but because it was convenient." Curlenth cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, what do we do about this? Do we confiscate the rocks? Add minerals to the restricted materials list? Require disclosure of geological knowledge?" The absurdity of the suggestion hung in the air for a moment. Kelrick shook his head slowly. "We do what any rational civilization does when faced with evidence that our fundamental assumptions were wrong. We convene a committee, conduct a study, and spend the next several cycles arguing about what this means while changing absolutely nothing, because the alternative is admitting we've been wrong for 3,000 cycles." He turned back to Marcus. "You have violated no protocols because we never imagined we needed a protocol for rocks. Congratulations. You have found the loophole in civilization itself." Marcus nodded politely, accepting this with the grace of someone who had expected exactly this response. The remainder of the training was officially suspended, pending a full review of the preservation protocols, which would take approximately 2 cycles and involve testimony from specialists in 17 different fields. The cadets were returned to their base, fed properly, and given counseling to process what they had witnessed. Several of them filed requests for human cultural education courses. One requested to learn primitive fire-making techniques, was denied, appealed the decision, and started a bureaucratic battle that would echo through administrative channels for years. Marcus returned to his regular duties as a maintenance technician, though his reputation had evolved somewhat. Aliens who had previously regarded humans as just another member species now watched them with a mixture of respect and nervousness, the way one might regard a friend who had casually revealed they could speak to the dead or bend steel with their thoughts. The incident report, when it was finally filed 6 weeks later, ran to 400 pages and required input from legal teams, scientific observers, cultural specialists, and 3 different committees. The conclusion, buried in subsection 97 under Appendix K, was both simple and profound. Humans had complied with all relevant protocols, while simultaneously rendering the entire framework of those protocols questionable. A proposal to add stones to the list of restricted materials was submitted, debated, and ultimately rejected when someone pointed out that restricting access to rocks would be both impossible to enforce and absurd enough to make the entire galactic community a laughingstock. A secondary proposal to require species to declare knowledge of primitive fire-making techniques was also rejected, primarily because nobody wanted to admit that knowledge itself could be more dangerous than technology. In the end, nothing changed except everything. The preservation protocols remained in place. Species continued to surrender their fire-making devices upon joining galactic civilization. But somewhere in the back of every administrator's mind was the uncomfortable knowledge that compliance with the letter of the law did not necessarily mean compliance with the spirit of the law, and that humans had proven definitively that the two were not the same thing. Marcus, for his part, continued to carry rocks in his pockets, just in case. And on cold nights across dozens of human vessels and stations, people who had never needed to start a fire without technology took a moment to learn how, passing down knowledge that predated written language, that had carried their species from caves to stars, not because they needed it, but because forgetting seemed like a waste. The galaxy had learned an important lesson from the incident on Keltar 7, though not the lesson the preservation protocols had intended to teach. Advanced technology and primitive knowledge were not opposites on a spectrum of civilization. They were different tools for different circumstances, and the wisest species kept both in their toolbox. Because sometimes the most advanced thing you can do is remember how to strike stones together and create fire in the darkness, feeding yourself and others while the rescue drones circle overhead, confused by sensors that cannot classify warmth created by human hands and rocks that refuse to read the regulations about what they were permitted to do. The trainers had taken their Firestarters, locked them away, and waited for the cold to teach appreciation for technology. The human had struck stone, lit flames, cooked a meal, and taught a different lesson entirely: that true capability meant never being helpless, whether you had all the technology in the galaxy or nothing but rocks, knowledge, and the determination to survive. And that was the most human thing of all.